We devote the remainder of our program tonight to the controversy surrounding U.S. aid to the anti-government rebels of Nicaragua, the Contras. Will Contra aid, a centerpiece of the administration's foreign policy, survive the current scandal? The disclosure that money was illegally diverted from Iran arms sales to the Nicaraguan civil war. The administration is aggressively trying to make the answer yes. On Capitol Hill today, the administration's point men for Central America were appealing for continued American support for the Contras. Assistant Secretary of State Elliott Abrams was the key witness to appear before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. He was asked about the prospects for a Contra military victory.
Outright military victory, if you mean Contra tanks rolling into Managua, has never been a part of U.S. policy. What we seek is a political victory, the kind of victory the Sandinistas had, or for that matter, that Castro had.
Well, the Sandinistas had a victory, which ultimately they rolled into Managua.
No, they didn't have a military victory. They had a political victory. They had a political uprising against Somoza, as Castro had against Batista, but it wasn't a military victory.
Oh, I see.
It was not the kind of victory we had in World War II. That was a pure military victory. We didn't change the minds of the German people. We just won. That's not what we're talking about in Nicaragua. We're talking about a guerrilla war. And it is the kind of situation, in fact, that the Sandinistas themselves are very familiar with.
But the end result is you've got to have Ortega in a speedboat heading west or east.
No,
right?
You don't. You don't. In fact, the Nicaraguan resistance offered a couple of years ago a kind of settlement in which Ortega stays right there as long as he is willing to open up to democracy, which, as you know, he's not real keen on.
Well, you don't have any prospect that that's likely to happen, do you? I mean, do you believe, after I listened to all the forthright statements of the senator from North Carolina and you, Mr. Abrams, and other witnesses, I mean, nobody believes that that's going to happen, do they?
No, I would think that's going too far for two reasons. First, because of the because of the map, because of where Nicaragua is. And second, because if the policy works, they're going to have their backs against the wall and they will have no other choice.
Well, according to your definition of winning, how long do you think it will take to win?
We hate to be pinned down on time, but I'll give you an answer. I think you're talking about something like 2 to 4 years.
What are the real results? Why they've been in operation for 4 years? Is this a winning team? I don't see any prospects for... they don't control a single village. I don't see that they've had any victories. Why don't they control a single village?
As of 1984, when U.S. government aid to the Contras was cut off, they were doing splendidly. They had lots of momentum, and they had some degree of control in about half the country. And then that ended by vote of the U.S. Congress. What happened in the interim is that this huge gap has opened up between the capabilities of the Contras and those of the Sandinistas, in part because the Sandinistas have grown so much. Helicopter gunships, tanks, armored personnel carriers, 23,000 tons of Soviet arms last year. Now, of course, we're trying to catch up. This program has been in effect for 10 weeks. In reality, that is, equipment has been moving, training has been underway for about 10 weeks. What are the results? First result, of course, is a number of people have been trained, thousands of people have been re-equipped, and thousands have been re-infiltrated into Nicaragua, where some are already fighting and others are walking to the positions, to the areas where they will be undertaking their responsibilities. And in fact, the number of skirmishes has already increased significantly. That's in 10 weeks, and I think it's a pretty good result.
Congress is not only concerned about official U.S. aid to the Contras, there's also the money sent to them from other sources. Congress and the Independent Council are trying to follow the celebrated trail of cash from the 1986 Iran arms sales to the Contras. But they are also curious about funding operations that began 2 years earlier, after Congress passed legislation barring official U.S. aid. It's a trail that also involves Lieutenant Colonel Oliver North and others at the National Security Council and the Central Intelligence Agency. Our report is by correspondent Charles Krause.
Devilishly hot and depressingly poor, Corinto is Nicaragua's largest port. In April 1984, warning buoys marked areas where mines had been discovered, mines that threatened the country's economic lifeline. At first, the Contras claimed responsibility. But by the end of April 1984, press reports forced the CIA to admit that it was responsible for what was clearly an act of war. There was an uproar in Congress and grave concern at the White House that the mining might lead to a ban on future aid to the Contras. They were then and remain key to the administration's policy in Central America. In early May, President Reagan made an impassioned, televised appeal for continued aid to the rebels.
The simple questions are, will we support freedom in this hemisphere or not? Will we defend our vital interests in this hemisphere or not? Will we stop the spread of communism in this hemisphere or not?
But Congress was not persuaded. Shortly after the president's address, it passed the Boland Amendment, which prohibited all direct and indirect aid to the Contras for a 2-year period beginning in November 1984. But what Congress couldn't know then was that before the Boland Amendment took effect, Oliver North and possibly others at the White House and the CIA were already apparently making contingency plans to keep the Contras alive. According to the Senate Intelligence Committee report and other information now available, those contingency plans would lead to a complicated, covert program involving secret Swiss bank accounts, donations worth tens of millions of dollars from at least 2 foreign governments, weapons from Israel, money, military trainers, and other weapons from what was described as a private aid network in the United States. And finally, the diversion of $10 to $30 million from the Iranian arms sales to the Contras. It all apparently began not last year, but in May of 1984. That month, North and a CIA operative named Dewey Claridge reportedly traveled to Honduras. There, they met with leaders of the Contras.
Colonel North came with someone that was using the name of Dewey Maroney, that later on I learned from the press that his name was Dewey Claridge. This Dewey Claridge was the chief of the Central Intelligence Agency for the anti-Sandinista operations.
Edgar Chamorro is a former member of the Contra leadership. He was not at the May meeting, but he says he was told about it later.
The whole purpose was to keep our morale high, to make us believe that there was a definite commitment from the highest office in America that regardless what Congress thought on this matter, there was a very serious commitment of the President of the United States, and that President was telling us, we will never abandon you.
Ralph McGehee is a former covert operations officer who was awarded the CIA's prestigious Career Intelligence Medal before retiring in 1977. Since then, he's become a leading critic and keeps extensive files on the CIA, reading between the lines of information that becomes public. In April 1984, the Washington Post reported that the White House had requested the CIA to create a slush fund for Central America. Although the Post quoted White House sources denying the CIA had agreed to create the fund, McGehee says he thinks the denial was pro forma.
I think that's exactly what happened. They drew off huge sums of money to be able to fund the Contras.
McGehee says that in the past, the CIA has gotten around congressional prohibitions by providing 2 or 3 years' worth of funding to an organization before the ban takes effect. The practice is called surge funding.
Another way of doing such surge funding is to give money to an individual who then might donate it to a foundation, and the foundation would provide money, or the individual himself could give so-called private contributions to the Contras. The money was there, was distributed before the congressional prohibition, and it's there, and it was there and available.
Well, we became aware of it through individuals who came to my office because of my known opposition to the assistance to the Contras, and they began to tell a tale that really articulated an enormous web that was being spun to provide aid to the Contras.
As a result of the information brought to him last year, Senator John Kerry ordered his staff to investigate the private groups and individuals known or suspected of providing aid to the Contras. To what extent do you believe that the private aid network was created and used by the CIA and the NSC, the White House, to circumvent the Boland Amendment?
I think it was specifically created to circumvent the Boland Amendment. This network represents the privatization, if you will, of foreign policy. And the White House, I think Oliver North is quoted in one magazine as saying that if it weren't for those people up on the Hill, we wouldn't have to be breaking the law. And so they had this subterranean operation, if you will, run outside of all of the normal channels, which is, I think, the most egregious part of what we're witnessing here. A sort of private effort to carry out a policy contrary to the will of the American people as expressed through their elected representatives.
According to the Senate Intelligence Committee, in a preliminary report by Kerry's staff, 3 men played key roles as intermediaries between North, the private aid network, and the Contras themselves. They were General John Singlaub, former chairman of the World Anti-Communist League, who claims to have raised millions of dollars for the Contras from private sources. General Richard Secord, a former Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense, who was directly involved with Colonel North in the Iranian arms sales and providing weapons to the Contras. And finally, Robert Owen, a paid consultant to North at the National Security Council, whose photograph has never been published. The Kerry report also identifies 4 groups allegedly used to channel or to provide cover for money, arms, military trainers, and other aid to the Contras during the 2-year period the Boland Amendment was in effect. They are the Cuban Legion and Brigade 2506, both Cuban exile groups headquartered in Miami. The Recondo Military Training School of Dolomite, Alabama, described as a training school for mercenaries recruited to fight with the Contras. And Civilian Military or Materiel Assistance, a group of Vietnam veterans and others who support the Contras, headquartered in Decatur, Alabama. Colonel Sam Dickens is an executive at the American Security Council, a conservative pro-Contra lobbying group in Washington. He says the notion that the private aid network was controlled by North or by the CIA is a figment of Senator Kerry's imagination.
The thought that the U.S. government controlled private sector operations is really ridiculous. It's various organizations that have their own membership, and so it's sort of an interlocking, interrelated, all with the same common purpose, but not a formal network where there's a leader giving instructions to people down the line to provide this.
Do you think your activities are viewed favorably by the White House?
Yes, absolutely, yes. Anyone that's playing a positive role and a strong role encouraging the Reagan administration's efforts to support the Contra, of course, is going to be viewed favorably.
But Dickens refuses to say where millions of dollars known to have reached the Contras through the private aid network came from. Why does it have to be secret?
Because things have changed in this world, and if anyone doesn't see that, then they haven't lived very long as an adult in the United States. Look at different church groups, look at other groups. You do anything that's counter to a view of certain groups, and you're mercilessly attacked.
Do you have an idea of how much money we're talking about?
No, I don't claim to have that, and I don't think we do yet. I think the money, obviously, is the key to this whole thing.
Jack Terrell claims to know where some of the money came from. He's now with a liberal foreign policy group in Washington which opposes aid to the Contras. But during part of 1984 and 85, Terrell was military commander in Honduras for civilian military assistance. CMA claims that it has done nothing more than provide $5 million worth of humanitarian aid to the Contras since 1984.
But we were definitely a military group. We were there to establish training bases and put trainers in the field with Contra groups. And there were also military missions run.
Terrell claims that in January 1985, he attended a meeting arranged by Adolfo Calero, a leader of the FDN, one of the Contra groups. At the meeting, a mysterious American named John Hull, who owns a farm in Costa Rica.
He brought with him Robert Owen. This was the first time I'd ever met Owen or Hull. And I was told by Calero that Hull was the CIA liaison to the FDN in Costa Rica. And Hull told me that Owen was the NSC liaison. They wanted 30 American trainers to be sent to Costa Rica. When I asked Hull where the money was going to come from to get these people there, to feed and clothe them and support their logistical operations, Owen told me that he carried $10,000 a month to John Hull. And I said, from where? He said, the NSC. And I said, what's NSC? I didn't know at that time. He said, Ollie. I said, Ollie who? He said, you don't know Oliver North with the National Security Council? And I said, no, because it didn't mean anything to me. But I wasn't the only one that knew he was carrying money down. And this was, as you look back in hindsight, this was a cash payment from the National Security Council to John Hull to help form the Southern Front.
Did you know at that time that that would have been totally illegal? I mean, the Boland Amendment had gone into effect at that time?
Sure, we knew about the Boland Amendment. We weren't concerned with that because if you felt you were sitting in the presence of two U.S. government officials, whether they were liaisons or career or contract or whatever, and these people are making a request of you for American trainers and they're going to pay for it and whatever, it's not our cross to bear.
CMA, the private aid group with which Terrell was affiliated, is headed by Tom Posey, who's visited Contra camps in Honduras at least 8 times since 1984. A Vietnam veteran himself, Posey is intimately familiar with the way the Contras operate, and on a first-name basis with their commanders. We met with Posey at CMA headquarters in Decatur, Alabama. There, he showed us through a warehouse where he says thousands of CMA members from around the country have donated millions of dollars worth of aid for the Contras.
And it comes in from all over. It's used, and some of it is new stuff that people's bought. Civilian backpack. Cards. Silverware for the troops. A little bit of everything.
Posey says CMA is not a paramilitary group, and that his old comrade in arms, Terrell, is a convicted felon and a liar. As for Senator Kerry and his allegations...
Seems like he's, bent on hell to make sure that communism isn't defeated in Central America. Just like on so-called his investigation committee, he uses individuals for affidavits and testimony that are convicted felons, and some of them are still in jail. That's his credible witnesses. Lord gosh.
We asked Posey about the Kerry report, which says that CMA provided money and weapons to the Contras. He denied it. The report also says that General Singlaub of the World Anti-Communist League and Robert Owen were 2 key links between Oliver North and private aid groups like Posey's CMA.
Do you know General Singlaub?
I've met him, yes, sir, twice. At the World Anti-Communist League in Dallas, Texas. Talked to him for about an hour. And we just talked.
However, he does not, well, let me ask you.
Does he control us? No, sir. I wish to God, per se, if somebody was going to control us, they would control us and take some of the bills off our back.
Have you ever met Robert Owen?
Yes, sir.
Where did you meet him?
That was down in Florida with Adolfo Calero. And he told us that he was the liaison officer, per se, between FDN and General Singlaub.
He told you between FDN and General Singlaub?
Yes, sir.
He never mentioned Colonel North or the NSC?
No, sir. As for him giving us advice, money, supplies, anything, no, sir. I don't even think he gave us the time of day.
Why do you think Senator Kerry and others have sort of focused on you and on CMA?
That's it. Because the only way that they can get at us, and I'm talking as though Senator Kerry is on the opposition, is to throw as much mud as possible to try to dirty the waters where we can't get help for the freedom fighters.
I think we're going to have to let the future record declare the truth or non-truth of Mr. Posey's statements. It would be inappropriate for me at this point to render any judgment as to it. But I will say that there is significant evidence in public, beyond what my staff has developed, and those allegations point directly at a more specific involvement by Mr. Posey. They point specifically, and the witnesses we've talked to point specifically, at shipments of arms that have gone out of the United States to the Contras, and at part of the network, including Posey's group, being involved in those shipments and training prospects and other efforts to assist the Contras.
But it now appears that far larger arms shipments were arranged by North through intermediaries in Portugal. Lisbon is a center of the international black market for arms, and weapons of the type used by the Contras are manufactured here. According to the Washington Post, beginning in early 1985, Energy Resources International of Vienna, Virginia, ordered about 800 tons of weapons and ammunition in Portugal for the Contras. Energy Resources had the same address as another company belonging to General Richard Secord and his partner Albert Hakim, who were also involved in selling arms to Iran. According to the Senate Intelligence Committee report, in addition to helping with the Iranian arms deal, Secord and Hakim were described by North as his principal aides for Contra activities in Europe. McGehee says that based on information that's now public, it appears to him that Secord in particular may well have been working for both North at the White House and the CIA.
We know that he attends meetings at the CIA, that he goes around to the various countries and contacts CIA personnel. How can he do that? The identity of the chief of station in Lisbon is secret. The identity of other personnel in other places is secret. How can he contact them? How can he use agency communications? If not, he's not CIA.
McGehee and others surmised that the weapons from Portugal, worth millions of dollars, were paid for initially either by the CIA or by Saudi Arabia, which is believed to have donated $30 million to the Contras beginning in 1982 at the behest of the Reagan administration. Then, beginning last year, money diverted from the Iranian arms sales may have been used by North and Secord to buy weapons and to pay for dropping them by air to Contra forces inside Nicaragua. Secord has been linked to that operation, which ended last October when a plane carrying weapons to the Contras from Ilopango Air Force Base in El Salvador was shot down over Nicaragua. Aboard the plane was Eugene Hasenfuss, who was captured by the Nicaraguan government, and who told them he thought he was working for the CIA. But the White House disavowed Hasenfuss, claiming no U.S. government agency or personnel had anything to do with him or the Contra resupply mission he was part of. Diggins of the American Security Council still cannot believe the administration would have violated the Boland Amendment by sponsoring the Hasenfuss-Secord operation.
Maybe it was possible to raise enough money from the private sector to provide for that operation. I do know one thing. It was an amateurish operation. It was not run by the CIA. It wasn't run by any government agency.
That is simply not plausible. And if it is plausible that they didn't know what was going on, then every single one of them should be fired and we ought to get a new CIA. I mean, it is simply unacceptable to me that there were CIA people at Ilopango Air Base and at other bases not aware of Southern Air Transport and other people bringing these supplies in and of the operation of these people, which clearly was in the open for everybody to see. It just defies common sense.
But the official story now appears to be unraveling. Just this week, the Washington Post reported that the CIA has relieved its station chief in Costa Rica. The reason? He provided back-channel communications for the resupply effort at the direction of Colonel North, and with the knowledge of at least one of his superiors at the CIA, Claire George, Deputy Director of Clandestine Operations.
If he's using the back channel communications, his activities have to be known. If George knows about it, the agency knows about it.
McGehee thinks the station chief is being made to take the fall for the agency.
Well, they're trying to focus the blame on him, to keep it away from the CIA. There are all sorts of levels of cover stories to maintain plausible deniability. And when one cover story fails, then you peel off another one. And when that fails, you've got another one. Everything to avoid the truth, the real core truth from being reported.
And what do you expect the core truth really is in this case?
That the CIA has been intimately involved in supporting the Contras all along.
Up until now, the Contras have refused to divulge where their money and where their arms came from during the 2-year period the Boland Amendment was in effect. And they claim they've received no money diverted from the Iranian arms sales. But with Congress and now a special prosecutor investigating, it may be only a matter of time before the full story is known.
And now we talk with Adolfo Calero, one of the principal leaders of the Contras. Mr. Calero is the head of the Nicaraguan Democratic Force, which is the largest group within the anti-Sandinista resistance movement known as UNO, the United Nicaraguan Opposition. Mr. Calero, welcome.
Thank you.
First, did the United States government continue to help you during the 2 years of the Boland Amendment?
Well, funding was ended in 1984, and aside from trying to get Congress to vote for us, aside from very clear pronouncements by the President of the United States and other officers of this government that we needed aid, that we needed support, and that they were in our favor, we did not get any aid from the government of the United States. We didn't get any money from the government of the United States. We didn't get any arms. We didn't get any ammunition. We got moral support, and we got backing from the United States officials, beginning with the President.
Well, who did keep you going then during the 2 years? How did you survive?
Well, we did receive funds from international banks, 2 accounts in international banks that we had, and we did buy ammunition and weapons, and we did buy food to eat, and through a very lean operation, we made it through until 1985 when we began to get the humanitarian aid, and now, until now, that we are beginning to get military aid.
Are you suggesting, Mr. Calero, that the U.S. government had nothing at all to do with the money in these international bank accounts and all the other aid that you got?
I am not suggesting it. I am saying that the United States government had nothing to do with that.
Colonel North told the Attorney General of the United States, Edwin Meese, told the Senate Intelligence Committee that Colonel North told him that he opened three Swiss bank accounts, told you about them, and it is his belief that you took out $3 to $4 million out of those accounts, and that you thanked him for it.
I read the Senate Intelligence Report, and you are quoting very liberally
I'm paraphrasing.
from it.
Right, I'm paraphrasing.
Yes, you're paraphrasing, and it doesn't state
did
that
it
exactly.
Did it happen?
We had no control over any accounts. We never had any accounts in Switzerland, and I never had anything. I never received any money to thank Colonel North for.
So he's just hallucinating if he said that?
Well, I don't know. Maybe there's some break in the communications. Just as you were quoting a little bit liberally, maybe Mr. Meese quoted him liberally. And,
all right, then let's be more direct about it, regardless of what Meese said and what North said, whatever.
Okay.
You're saying that you never took any money out of any Swiss bank account?
We have never received any money from the Iran, let's say, Iran-U.S.
Well, how do you know if you took? In other words, if you took money out of out of a bank in Switzerland, how do you know where it came from?
Well, because it all refers to the Iran-U.S. problem, you see, and we never had any bank accounts in Switzerland.
Okay.
We have never controlled any bank accounts in Switzerland, and at the time of the arms sales to Iran, we have not received any substantial amounts. The only money we received in 1986 was about $1 million. And we can trace the origin of that money, and we know more or less, almost of it, we know who contributed it. So it cannot have come from Iran.
Well, what about the private network that Charles Krause just reported on, the various American groups, et cetera? You heard what Senator Kerry told him, that he believes that the CIA has been operating this from the very beginning, still does, apparently. Do you agree with the senator?
Well, I do not agree with Senator Kerry at all. And I would say that parts of that report sounded like the 1001 Nights. You know, there's a lot of imagination put into all of this, a lot of mystery. And a lot of the people who were in it I have met. When we submit, and we will submit, all our books, all our bank accounts, all our dealings to the proper American authorities, it will be clearly established that there has been a lot of fantasy in all of these findings and
But for what purpose, Mr. Calero? Why would people make all of this up?
I can imagine what I saw, for instance, in the report. A gentleman that I met at one time, Mr. Terrell, you know, who,
Jack Terrell,
yes,
right,
Jack Terrell, who Mr. Posey says is a former convict, a felon, and he was a great Contra supporter. He wanted to make an Operation Pegasus, and he wanted to invade Nicaragua. He wanted to do very many things. When we got a notion of what kind of a man he was, then he left us and went to the Indians, to the Mosquito Indians. And he's a man full of imagination. I mean, he presented himself to us as a
Mosquito Indians, a group of people in Nicaragua, who opposed the Sandinistas.
Yeah, in the
well.
northeastern coast. They have been terribly persecuted by the Sandinistas. Well, Mr. Terrell presented himself to us as a former member of the Special Forces of the United States, and I later found out that he never got even close to that.
But Mr. Calero, the point here is that all of these people seem to be raising money. There have been all these reports. We don't need to review them again.
Yes.
Of Colonel North did this, and Mr. Owen did that, and there were meetings with you in Honduras and elsewhere saying the U.S. government is with you. Money appeared, supplies appeared. You did not believe that the two were connected?
The United States is not the only supplier of democratic funds in the world, you know. And we are very happy now that we have U.S. funds. And we are very happy about the U.S. decision in Central America. And what I can very clearly say is that I, for one, never saw any connection of these funds with the United States government.
Okay. Arturo Cruz, one of your colleague leaders in the Contras, reportedly is ready to call it quits. Is that true, and what effect is that going to have if it is?
I have not heard Mr. Cruz say that. I really wish that Mr. Cruz would stay. However, there are differences. In all democracies there are differences. Pluralism is very important. But I am sure that whatever differences Mr. Cruz and I have are superseded by our objective, which is to liberate Nicaragua.
Liberate Nicaragua meaning?
Liberate Nicaragua from communism.
Okay.
He, I am sure, is intent on that. I'm intent on that. And so are thousands of Nicaraguan boys who are now fighting. And when I say 1,000, I mean there are 10,000 now Nicaraguan boys since December fighting the Sandinistas inside.
Do you think it's possible to win a military victory?
We have never spoken of a military victory or of an unconditional surrender. But the military factor is important to wear the Sandinistas down, to force them into reason, to keep them from consolidating. Look, if it were not for us, the revolution without borders announced by the Sandinistas would have taken place. We have kept the Sandinistas at bay. At one point, Fidel Castro said that he was going to have breakfast in Managua, lunch in San Salvador, and dinner in Guatemala. We have kept him having all three meals in Managua, I grant you.
All right, Mr. Calero, thank you. Robin?
Now we go back to Capitol Hill, where the fate of the Contras ultimately may be decided. With us from the Senate gallery are a Democratic member of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, Christopher Dodd of Connecticut, and a Republican member of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, Henry Hyde of Illinois. Congressman Hyde also is a member of both the House Intelligence Committee, which held hearings on the Iran-Contra affair, and of the new Select Committee, which will continue that investigation. Congressman Hyde, you support the Contras. Are you concerned about the mounting evidence that aid continued to them during the 2-year ban imposed by the Boland Amendment?
Well, I'm delighted that aid continued to them. Otherwise, they would have been decimated. It just seemed to me they had a real problem while Congress did its pirouette and cut them off and then decided to supply them. So in that interim, while they were relying on us, on the forces of freedom in the world to feed and clothe and arm them, I'm just delighted they were able to get some aid from people who were a little wiser than this Congress was during that period.
How do you feel about that, Senator Dodd?
Well, they were wise and clever, but they were, I think, violating the law of this country. We have a system of government that requires that there be checks and balances and approval of funding by the Congress of the United States. We're about to celebrate our 200th anniversary of a constitutional form of government. The president was unhappy. My good friend and colleague, Henry Hyde, was unhappy. But if we're going to go around and let lieutenant colonels and admirals decide they're going to squeeze other governments and use whatever means illegal or unethical or immoral in order to do what they want to do, then we might as well abandon this constitutional process. That's more important.
Can I just ask the Senator, do you believe the evidence that it was actually the administration which was covertly gathering, directing, and delivering this aid during that period, Senator?
I don't. You say the administration. Clearly, there are people within the administration. We'll know it later on with the hearings of the House and the Senate how high up officials in the administration were that may have approved this. But certainly, the administration was involved. I mean, clearly, we know that much already, with 2 high-ranking officials taking the Fifth Amendment. What we don't know yet is whether or not it went higher, how much more, if at all, the president was directly involved, what other pressure was brought to bear on allies to provide assistance where we were threatening to either cut them off from our own economic programs or whatever. So clearly, the administration was involved, and I would even go a step further. I'm convinced that at least officials within the government were directly involved in directing part of the operations in Central America.
Do you believe that, Congressman Hyde?
Well, I think that remains to be proved. These charges have been flying around, and I'm waiting for all of these witnesses to be put under oath and to testify under oath, and then we'll have the evidence. Right now, I'm unwilling to indict and convict anybody of illegal conduct. I am disappointed, dismayed at Colonel North and Admiral Poindexter in pleading the Fifth Amendment. I hope we get to the bottom of it, and I do not condone illegalities, breaking the law by anybody in our government. But that is simply a charge. We don't know that yet. But meanwhile, the forces of freedom are in the field and carrying it to the communist Sandinistas, and that pleases me.
Do the achievements of the Contras in military terms, in human rights terms, in political terms, Congressman, justify further military aid from the U.S. Congress?
They certainly do, if you're reasonable in your expectations of what a guerrilla war can produce. Nobody expects the tanks to roll into Managua and to push the Sandinistas out, but they are tying them down, they are keeping them introverted instead of extroverted. And if we will ever tell the world we're there for the long haul, we're not going to run out of breath, we might buck up the other countries down there to join us in a diplomatic and economic isolation of the Sandinistas and get rid of them just as we got rid of Somoza back in 1979.
Senator, Congress has been very skittish about this issue, approving, then denying, then approving again aid to the Contras. The Democratic Party has been fearful of being charged with losing Nicaragua. Is a majority of the Congress in both houses going to buy it this time, do you believe?
I believe that a majority in both houses will vote to cut off funding for next year. I'm not sure whether or not if there were a vote on the 40 million, or the remains of the 100 million, that we could vote on as late as, or as early rather, as the end of this month, that there is a majority in either the House or the Senate for that proposition.
Let's just spell this out. There are 2 votes coming up. One later this month, which would be whether to continue the aid that's already been approved, that 40 million you speak of.
That's correct.
And then there's another vote later in the spring on the administration's request for an additional new 105 million. Is that correct?
That's correct, for next year, next year's budget.
So you believe the second one will go down, but you're not sure about the first one.
That's correct. I've talked to a number of my colleagues, Republicans and Democrats in the Senate, who have expressed to me reluctance about voting against the 40 million. That would be a continuation to complete the 100 million for this year, but have indicated that they're getting awfully tired of this program and do not see that it is working. Will point to the fact, as I've said on numerous occasions in the past, that the Soviets, the Cubans, the Eastern Europeans are growing in numbers inside Nicaragua, that repression and all the things that those who are in favor of the Contras are increasing in Nicaragua. This program isn't working. It's in fact, as some have argued, working to the advantage of the Sandinista government rather than to their disadvantage, and that maybe we ought to try something new. That is a feeling that is growing in both Republican as well as Democratic circles.
Is it growing in your part of Republican circles, Congressman Hyde?
Well, I think what Chris Dodd means by something new is really something old. That is negotiate, as though the communist Sandinistas are going to yield power because somebody asked them to. You take the Contras out of the field and you eliminate one element of pressure that, in my judgment, is indispensable to getting them to sit down and live up to the promises they made to the OAS, Organization of American States, in '79.
That may be what you wish, Congressman, and you've been very consistent in saying this over the years we've been interviewing about this, but what do you think all your fellow Republicans will do? Are they going to buy the administration argument this time, a majority?
A majority will. There will be a few defectors, as there are a few defectors from Chris's party to our side. I am not optimistic that we can carry the day, but I'm not giving up the struggle at all, because the stakes are enormously high.
If Arturo Cruz resigns from the Contras, the man many regard as one of the people who gave them more respectability in the eyes of the Congress, as he was a former Sandinista official who defected, if he resigns, Congressman McCurdy says he's the glue that holds it together. You might as well say goodbye to further aid up there, meaning where you are in Congress. Is he right?
Well, Congressman McCurdy is easily dissuaded from supporting the Contras. I don't think the cause of freedom in Nicaragua, not to say Central America, depends on the presence of one man. However, I would be disappointed if Arturo Cruz resigns. He is a very good man, and he's very helpful. I hope he understands, and I'm sure he does, this cause is bigger than the differences that perhaps divide him and Mr. Calero.
Senator Dodd, if Cruz resigns, would that affect the vote later this month on the 40 million?
It will have an effect. I wouldn't go so far as to, as Congressman McCurdy has. I'm not sure it is the straw that will break the camel's back, but it's certainly yet one other piece of information that is increasing the concern among people up here, regardless of where they were in the past on this issue. The recent stories about the training of Contras, trying to convince them to support the political leadership, and then being told once they got back to Honduras and Nicaragua to totally disregard that. Their real leaders were the military leaders, is yet further evidence of the failure to really put together the kind of cohesive program that I know Henry Hyde and others who have supported the Contras would have liked to have seen. That information is contributing to the fatigue that I mentioned earlier, that I think will cause Republicans and Democrats to say, let's try something new. And it is new, Henry. We really haven't tried to resolve this problem that Nicaragua poses through the diplomatic and political channels.
Well, thank you. Jim?
Mr. Calero, if Senator Dodd is right, and that you get your 40 million for the rest of this year, but you don't get 105 next year, or you don't ever get any more, what happens to your movement?
Well, let's get the 40 million first and see where we will be politically and militarily when the time for the vote comes. I believe that we will have made great progress, that we will have enhanced, we will have broadened the political base of the leadership, and that it will have been a Nicaraguan decision, which is very important because it will emanate from the assembly.
Decision,
and from the
what kind of decision?
Decision about the broadening of the base of the political leadership. That'll be very important.
Of your organization?
Of our organization, yeah, of the UNO, of the Unified Nicaraguan Opposition, yes.
Right.
And I look for, we have to win those 105 million. we have only had, as Mr. Abrams said today in a program just before, we've only had 10 weeks of support by the United States government. They got to give us a chance. They got to give us a chance to prove ourselves. And we're not asking for any money right now.
Let's ask Senator Dodd. Senator, is there anything that Mr. Calero and his group could accomplish that would win your vote eventually for that 105 million or even the 40 million?
Well, there are a number of things they'd have to do before, not just my vote, but others. First of all, it's been more than 10 weeks. I know that there's constantly trying to shorten the time. We're going back over a period of 5 or 6 years. Granted, the Congress has gone off and on, but as we now know, there have been other sources of funding that have come forward. But certainly, it is important, I think, and I don't think Mr. Calero would disagree with this. The Contras are going to have to demonstrate broad-based support inside Nicaragua. That will become evident, I think, in a matter of weeks, if it isn't already, as they proceed, more of them, into Nicaragua. If they can't demonstrate popular support inside that country against the Sandinista government, that is going to doom them no matter how much money we give them.
My point would be this, then, and my question would be, what would have to happen to demonstrate that kind of support to make you have second thoughts about your position?
They're going to have to demonstrate that they can sustain an effort inside that country with the support of the Nicaraguan people and be effective militarily. Now, I would tell you, I also would tell you very quickly, I think this is the wrong approach. Mr. Calero and I don't fundamentally disagree on what we'd both like to see at the end of this road. We really disagree about whether or not his approach of the Contras or mine is the wiser path to follow.
Do you believe, Mr. Calero, that you can, within the next several weeks, demonstrate popular support?
Well, we are sure of popular support. And,
you are sure of it?
Yes, and Senator Dodd has a commitment that we will demonstrate that popular support.
How will you demonstrate it?
Well, it's already been taking place in Monimbo, in Managua, in Matagalpa,
What's
in
happening?
other cities.
What's happening?
There have been public manifestations, public protests in Nicaragua, and that wasn't seen before. The people in Nicaragua are waiting to see the light on the other side of the tunnel. They're waiting to see the possibility of success. They're waiting to see if the Sandinistas are vulnerable. And most of all, they're waiting to see American decision, a firm American policy backed by bipartisan policy.
That's not, you don't see that coming. You don't see that coming, do you?
Well, I mean, what Senator Dodd said sounded very encouraging.
Would you want to encourage him, Mr. Calero? Senator Dodd, would you want to encourage Mr. Calero that there is a bipartisan support coming for him and his cause?
I would like to encourage Mr. Calero to see if we can't get some support, serious support, to at least try to achieve the points that were raised in the Contadora effort, which enjoy support within the administration, we're told, that I think could take care of about 95% of his concerns. I think there's a greater chance of producing what he is anxious to see through that path than continuing the fight with the Contras, where I see more Soviets, more Cubans, more military hardware, and a greater security threat to everyone in the region.
And Congressman Hyde, you think that's nowhere to go, right?
Well, you know, it's so unfair to equate the Contras, to whom we have cut them off totally from '84 till October of last year, totally cut them out. They've been getting little peanuts from General Singlaub and some other people, whereas the Soviets have put in 23,000 metric tons of military assistance. So let us have a sustained support for them, and then the people will choose.
All right. Congressman, Senator, Mr. Calero, thank you all three very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.